without any further ado, I'd like to announce that Brian Feldman, who is head of product at Castle in San Francisco, who has an extensive background in application development, security, in-app monetization, and gamification, will be presenting today, ATO fraud is evolving into a security problem. Are you ready? So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Brian. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate you organizing this, and huge thanks to everyone at RHISAC for putting on these amazing training sessions. So yeah, thanks everyone for dialing in today. Really excited to share a lot of this content with you. And as the title says, you know, ATO fraud is evolving into a security problem. And I think one of the confusing pieces when you're looking at user security and fraud is what's what? You know, what's the difference between fraud and security? So a lot of what we're going to go through today is trying to make sense of it all. How did we end up where we are today with the types of attacks we're seeing? We're going to look at the complex market landscape, all the different vendors, and we're just going to try to get some clarity on what's what, so that ultimately you as a business can make better decisions when you're looking to implement tools and workflows that better protect not only your application, your business, but your users as well. So yeah, as Amy mentioned, my name is Brian Feldman. I'm head of product at Castle. At Castle, we are an account security platform. We work with lots of large online retailers such as yourself. We work with B2B SaaS companies, fintech, but our core focus in working with any of these businesses is helping them protect their end users. So we help these online businesses protect their customers. A little bit about my own background. It was in 2014 when I first started getting deeper into the security space. I joined a bot detection company, and that's where I really started to learn a lot about the quick evolution of these attacks. But interesting thing was, bookmarked on both sides of that experience, I was at companies that were more in the gaming space. And that's something I'm always drawn towards because I love applications and technologies that strive for the best user experience. I love playing games. I love everything with technology and how it interacts with people. And that's a really cool part about Castle, is it's bringing those two worlds together. So when we're talking about account security, it's not just the ability to detect an attack, but when users are involved and you need to reach out to a user, you need to engage that user, the account owner, let them know that something happened. All of a sudden, we're getting into in-app and out-of-band workflows that really have an impact on user experience. And that's the awesome part about all of us that are dealing with account security problems, is it's not just the security side of it, but it's the people side of it as well. And we're going to talk about that more throughout this presentation. There's going to be a lot of ground that we're going to cover today. So I want to give a quick agenda of the areas that we're going to discuss. So first, we're going to talk about the evolution of attacks. We're going to quickly touch on, you know, how did this quick growth in data breaches mixed with evolution of botnets lead to these problems we're seeing today with account takeovers and credential stuffing. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these terms, and credential stuffing, account takeovers have really skyrocketed in 2018 and 2019. So we're going to take a look at, how did we even get here? Why is this happening? We're going to look at the landscape, the marketplace. As these new types of attacks have been evolving, there have been vendors that have been popping up left and right over the last 10 to 15 years to try to combat it. So everything from bot detection to fraud tools to account security tools, they all start to overlap in different areas. So we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at, you know, where did they all come from and make sense of them? What do they each do? What are they all good at? Next, we're going to talk about, how do you explore areas where you can implement workflows into your own application. I think there's always this challenge when you're on a security team or a fraud team where you want to introduce new technologies or new techniques into your application, but you're always competing with other priorities. There's other business priorities, there's other product priorities, and that's a huge challenge to get security items onto the upcoming roadmap. So we're going to look at, if you're going to implement tools, if you're going to implement techniques, what are the things that you need to think about, and how can you think about these in a way where you're also considering core business metrics, retention rates, optimization rates, so that way you can come up with plans that all teams will agree on, that business teams, that product teams will buy into. And lastly, I'll share some quick wins. What is some low-hanging fruit, things that if you only have 1 or 2 week sprints where you can implement one thing to make your application incrementally stronger, I'll share a few of those quick tips. Awesome. So this right here, let me see if I can use the chat, but does anybody have any guesses what this is an image of?
Can I take a guess?
Yeah, go for it.
Looks like a floor plan to me.
Looks like a floor plan. So it's pretty close, actually. So there's a company called Strava, and Strava integrates with a lot of the fitness trackers. So anybody who's wearing a Fitbit bracelet, or they have a mobile app to track their jogging routines or their cycling routines, those GPS data points get uploaded into Strava's cloud, and Strava can do some really cool tracking technologies. And back in 2017, it was actually November of 2017, Strava had about 1 trillion GPS data points tracking workouts and jogging routines and cycling routines around the world. And they thought it would be pretty awesome to roll out a heat map like this. And this heat map was meant for their community, as ways for other, fitness enthusiasts to be able to find popular jogging routes, popular cycling routes in the neighborhoods around them. Or maybe if you're going to go traveling for business or traveling for vacation, you could find hot spots where people are exercising. So they launched this in November 2017, and it was a huge hit for most people. But there was one issue. Overnight, as soon as they launched this, there was military bases around the world, secret military bases, that started popping up on these heat maps. This right here is actually a map of a U.S. military base in Afghanistan. And you can't find this map anywhere on Google Maps. You can't find it on Apple Maps. It's hidden from all the popular apps out there. But as soon as Strava pushed these heat maps up, this was actually a route of the entire plan of the base, because military personnel there, as they were working out, they were using these apps to track their own routines, and it gave an exact, basically, floor plan, as you were saying, Amy, of this base. So what happened in this scenario is there's this unassuming connection where one technology, they do something with positive intentions for their community. They build a really interesting application, a really interesting tool that's meant for the good of their community. But you can quickly see how a nefarious team of actors might be able to use this for other purposes. And that's something that we're going to look at today, is these unassuming connections and how hackers are taking advantage of tools that all of us are building every day in our applications to make the user experience better, and how they can actually use that against us. So let's relate that to credential stuffing. Maybe not always as much as a national security topic, depending on the business that you're in, but there's a similar relation here. So with credential stuffing, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with this term, so I'll give a quick recap of it. So credential stuffing is where an attacker gets a large list of leaked credentials. So if we look at maybe a Yahoo leak that happened 10 years ago, and there's millions of username password combinations floating around the internet, an attacker can take that list and they can insert those username password combinations one by one into a login field of any application and see if there are any matches, see if any of those combinations actually exist on that application. This is what Castle sees every day. Any day at Castle, one of our businesses is being hit with a credential stuffing attack. They've become extremely prolific in the last 6 months. So this is actually one that I just pulled yesterday. This is one from this week. And this is what the typical credential stuffing attack looks like. If you're mapping out every failed login and every successful login, this is what it typically looks like. There's this large spike and wave in failed logins, as some script is trying to rotate through millions of credentials one by one to see if any are a hit. And some other companies, I believe Sif Science, put out a metric last year that said the average success rate of a credential stuffing attack, meaning if you're going to try 1 million credentials, the average percentage of those credentials that are going to successfully log into an account is somewhere between 1% to 3%, which is why you see this huge spike in failed logins with not as many successful logins. But recently, we've been seeing these attacks look more like this. We're looking at that middle spike in the failed logins. And the interesting thing about this attack, we're seeing more and more that look like this, where they're very short, they're very rapid paced, they're not that high of scale, but also they're extremely successful, where the hit rate, where the attack has the correct credentials, we've seen them closer to 20 to 40% success rates. So we started seeing these occurring more and more this year, and we were wondering, what is happening here? Why are these attacks getting so successful? And the first assumption was this business had a leak. Their own users' credentials were leaked. Therefore, when the attack is run, it's using the exact set of credentials. But it actually wasn't that obvious. We had to look a little bit back into the history of what had happened on this application in order to find some sort of unassuming connection there. And what we found was 5 months earlier, there was a spam attack on this business's password reset form. This is one of those forms where if you go to log in and maybe you forgot your password, you can click, I forgot my password, you type in your email address, and it'll send you a link to reset your password. And what happened 5 months earlier was there's a huge wave of activity hitting that password reset request endpoint. And at the time, we wrote it off as a spam attack. It was just spam hitting the site. We did an investigation. There was no ATOs that happened over that time. So we kind of bucketed it into this spam bucket, not necessarily a security issue, until we started seeing those more successful attacks happen. And what we actually ended up realizing was that hundreds of the emails, hundreds of the usernames that were involved in this password spam attack were the exact same username and emails that happened in the highly successful credential stuffing attack. So what was actually occurring was you had attackers who were using this form, the reset password form, as a tool. They were using it as a tool just to see which emails exist on this site. They're not trying to log into the accounts yet. They're just figuring out which of these email addresses even exist on the site. Because if the email address didn't exist on the site, then it would just return an error message saying email not found. And this was a way for the attacker to take a list of maybe 1 million credentials and weed out 90% of it, 98% of it even, to only the emails that exist on the application. That way they can run the credential stuffing attack a few months later only for those emails, and the success rate will be much higher, and the attack has a much better chance of slipping under the radar. So this is a tool similar to Strava. It was built for the users. It was built to deliver a positive user experience, but an attacker is able to use that tool against you. But let's take a step back even further. How did we get to where we are today, where these attacks are so prolific? They're so sophisticated. Why is credential stuffing on the rise? Why are we hearing this, almost every week now in the news? Well, I believe it was a natural evolution. On the left side, we're looking at numbers of user information, personal details that are floating around the internet. Right now, the site Have I Been Pwned has a little over 8.5 billion leaked credentials that are floating around the internet. 2017, there was 14.2 million credit card numbers exposed, 158 million social security numbers exposed. So just the sheer volume of user information that is floating around the internet is growing exponentially every year. Now you take that and you pair it with this very aggressive growth and innovation in bot technologies. Bot technology started as these very basic scripts where somebody wrote a script, they realized that with some JavaScript you could interact with a browser, or maybe with a Ruby script you could hit a specific endpoint of a browser and try to trigger some application actions. And then headless browsers came about. These were tools that were extremely easy to program, where you could basically launch headless Chrome browsers across the cloud. And this was made it even easier for those bots to look like actual human users. After that, CAPTCHA solving technology started popping up left and right. Today, it's extremely easy for any college intern to write a script that looks exactly like a human and can get past CAPTCHAs. On top of that, IPs are becoming more and more affordable. So you can launch these attacks at massive scale. And not only massive scale, but you can choose not only where you want to launch the attack from, but you can even launch it from residential IPs if you want to. So for example, it's very easy today with a click of a button to launch an attack from Comcast IPs, from Verizon wireless IPs. So these attacks are getting extremely sophisticated, where they look just like humans. They can get past these CAPTCHAs, and they can come in from IPs and ISPs that look like your normal sets of human traffic that are using your apps today. So when you pair the combination of this user information floating around the internet with this rapid innovation in bot technologies, it really was just a natural evolution for credential stuffing to occur. It's the path of least resistance. It's very easy for an attacker to run. It's very cheap for an attacker to run, and they're very profitable. So the law of economics just kind of forced this into the type of popularity that we're seeing it today. Now, the popular saying goes, with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So as that innovation in bot technologies was happening, as those data breaches were occurring, technologies were popping into the space to try to control it, to try to maintain the status quo and keeping these applications and users safe. So, 10, 15 years ago, WAFs, that was state-of-the-art perimeter detection, where you could easily upload blacklists of IPs, of user agents, of ISPs in order to keep the perimeter of your data center, the perimeter of your application safe. But as these headless browsers started popping up and the bots were getting more and more sophisticated, the WAFs weren't dynamic enough. They weren't able to update and adjust to real-time attacks quickly enough. This is really what spawned the birth of bot detection companies. And these companies became very good at stopping those massive scraping attacks, the DDoS attacks, because they were able to dynamically learn new patterns of bot activity and stop them in real time. Now, from the perspective of avoiding false positives, every technology starts where they're trying to just stop the attack. If you can detect it, you can stop it. But as the attacks get more and more sophisticated, you need to introduce tools that can handle the false positives and maybe handle a little bit of this gray area. Maybe it's a bot, maybe it's not a bot. And bot detection's approach to that is looking for a source of truth in the controller of the script. So this is where CAPTCHAs and rate limiters come into play. A CAPTCHA is basically asking the controller of the browser, are you human? Do you have human-like capabilities? Can you get past this CAPTCHA? So for bot detection, the source of truth is the controller of the script. And nowadays, the script itself can get past a lot of those workflows. As bots are proliferating more inside the application, attackers were realizing that you could do, credit card stuffing tactics, where if they had a list of stolen credit cards, you can get inside the application and try making purchases with these credit card numbers one by one. This is really what spawned this growth in fraud tools. These are tools that were sitting inside the application that could get triggered on key events like a transaction attempt. And they were looking for transactional fraud. They're looking for platform abuse. And they had to look for another source of truth here, because you can't necessarily, now that these attacks are getting more sophisticated and they were able to get past the CAPTCHAs, they needed another source of truth where if there was this maybe range, what do we do? How do we handle this from a user experience perspective if we're uncertain if we should kill that transaction or let it through? So fraud tools were able to escalate things to a support team. So if there wasn't 100% certainty, it can escalate a review, put a transaction on pause until a support team can come in, review it, and either allow the transaction or kill the transaction. Also, they were able to tap into workflows that could freeze an account. So if a bot was just creating a lot of abuse inside of an application, they could just freeze that account outright. So both of these technologies were really designed around stopping and slowing down automation. Bot detection was stopping the automation around the perimeter. Fraud tools were coming inside the app and trying to stop these automated attacks inside the application that were doing transactional fraud and platform abuse. Now, a little bit off to the side, there were UEBA tools that were growing in sophistication. This is user and entity behavioral analytics. This is where a lot of machine learning was coming into play, focused on understanding patterns of behavioral norms for the user. And if you can understand the behavioral norms for individual users, all of a sudden you can do other interesting things. Like you can stop phishing attacks. Phishing attacks aren't necessarily automated. A phishing attack can be a human-powered attack. If I was able to get access to my colleagues' credentials, I can go to my own computer and I can log in to their account. So account security tools started leveraging these UABA concepts of machine learning and building these patterns of norms for users so that you could stop even these human-powered account takeovers. They are also extremely sophisticated at the automated credential stuffing attacks as well. The other thing about account security tools is from the ground up, they were designed with user experience in mind. So in the case that it is able to detect that somebody else got into your account, they knew that they were going to have to kick off an account recovery flow. There's going to have to be a password reset flow that gets invoked. Also, if there's a question or there's a concern, is this the user, is it not the user, then they can kick in adaptive authentication flows. This is where MFA and second factor authentication flows are coming into play. So account security was really being designed separately from the user perspective first, not necessarily just for automated type attacks. And as this landscape is maturing, what's next? Can we predict what's next? And I believe we can. I think a lot of these technologies are going to start coming together. We're already seeing a lot of that overlap happening today. And I think what we're going to see really coming into maturity by the end of 2020, by the end of next year, is these user and application security tools that are really bringing the best, the world-class techniques of all those different technologies under one roof. They'll be able to do the UEBA, the user entity behavioral analytics, to offer world-class protection against phishing, credential stuffing, and ATO. They'll be able to sit inside of the app and see these critical in-app events so they have that transactional awareness and they can support content integrity. And also have the ability to do that bot detection to cut through those high volume spam attacks and just the general abuse that's taking place on platforms. Now, each one of those scenarios you need to react and respond to a bit differently. And this is where, if you're familiar with the term SOAR technologies come into play. SOAR stands for Security, Orchestration, Automation, and Response. So it's not always enough to just be able to detect an attack, but if you really want to take the burden off your teams, you need to be able to kick in a response in real time. Have a technology that can automate the mitigation and the recovery of that attack in real time. So these user and application security technologies next year are going to be able to detect these different types of attacks, whether it's an account security attack or it's a spam attack, and they need to be able to kick in any one of these workflows in real time. It needs to be able to kick in the CAPTCHAs and the rate limitings to slow down the general bot attacks. But it also needs to know how to engage with the user and kick off an account recovery flow that's going to be sending copy to the user. It's going to be gathering feedback from the user. For example, when you receive an email from Gmail saying, hey, we noticed some unusual activity, was this you? And you can say, yes, this was me, or no, this was not me. That feedback needs to get ingested to enhance the models even further. So this is what I believe we are going to be seeing launched in 2020. This is absolutely the direction that Castle is going. We have a lot of technologies that are rolling out this year and next year to achieve this type of vision, to really mature it so that all of these tools can be offered under one suite of APIs and one suite of tools. But of course, every business has that decision. Do you want to build it or do you want to buy it? And regardless of what your choice is, there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. So in this next section, I want to go through a few tips of, regardless if you're looking to build it in-house or you're looking to buy it in-house or buy it from a vendor that can provide the tools, what are some things that you need to be considering as you're exploring different options down this journey of securing your apps and securing your users? So I'm going to go through a few tips. My first tip is plan for the maybes. A lot of teams, both vendors and teams that are trying to build tools in-house, they're trying to build a system that can, when they're looking to detect an attack, if they're trying to detect a bot or they're trying to detect an account takeover, they're trying to design a system that's basically a Boolean system. Is this a bot? Yes or no. Is this an account takeover? Yes or no. And while we all want to strive for 100% accuracy, the reality is that technologies are going to have false positives. They are going to have false negatives, and you should plan for that. Be prepared for that. I would always recommend building a tool that you can design a range for low, medium, and high risk. You can have the yes, the no, and the maybe. What this allows you to do is you can design a portion of your models where you are extremely confident, where the false positive rate should be near 0%, 99.9999 accuracy rate, and consider that your high risk range. So if you flag something in that range, you can take a very aggressive action, knowing with extreme certainty and confidence that this is an attacking actor. But if you're only building for the yes and no, then you basically have to move that lever, and you're either going to introduce a significant degree of false positives and impact your user experience, impact your conversion rates, impact your retention rates, or you're going to go to the higher confidence and you're going to have no way of dealing with the maybes. You're going to have no way of dealing with that gray range. So have another range in there that is dedicated to that range. As you're doing your research, as you're making your tools smarter and smarter, be able to adjust that medium risk range where you're not certain, where something looks fishy, something looks suspicious, but you're not 100% confident yet to say this is an attack or this is safe behavior. Be able to lean into that gray area range. And not only do you want to be able to lean into that range, but build a system where you can adjust that throughout the application. So this is where you need to define your business objectives up front, because at each point in your application, you might have a different tolerance for risk. So for example, with hospitality and retail applications, you can gain a huge competitive advantage by offering a low friction user experience, especially at registration and at the login point. You want users to come into your application, become familiar with it, so that way when they're looking to purchase the next hottest wardrobe, or they're looking to book their next vacation, they're already familiar and comfortable with your platform. That's going to be the one that they're going to come into. You don't want to introduce barriers to entry, because that is your competitive advantage. So from that point of view, your tolerance for risk, your tolerance for friction at the registration point, at the login point, might be quite low. You might want to say, look, if something's in that maybe range, just let it in. Let's make that maybe range really small and err on the side of caution and not introduce friction for potential users, for potential new growth of our application. However, at the point of a transaction, this is where it's extremely costly if you're getting hit with fraud attacks. So this is where you might want to get more aggressive and slot things into a challenge range much earlier on. So build tools where you can adjust that low, medium, and high risk range depending on the point of the application you're in, depending on your specific business objectives and your specific tolerance for risk at every one of these points. This is where, businesses really vary. When we're working with fintech customers versus retail versus B2B SaaS, every business has a different sense and a different understanding of their users and their tolerance for risk. So they're able to customize this to fit their goals. Now, the next thing is, once you've defined these low, medium, and high risk thresholds for each of those locations, what are the actions you're actually taking? What are you going to do in the scenario that something is in that medium risk versus high risk range? And this is where you want to design a matrix. Make sure you're prepared with this, because when you do get hit with these attacks, there can be a lot of chaos. Just a quick example, with a credential stuffing attack, a lot of folks outside of the industry, they think that's something for security teams, for SecOps teams to deal with start to finish. But that's not always the truth. When you talk with a lot of our customers today and they've just gone through a credential stuffing attack, you find out that a lot of different teams across the organization had to get pulled into it. Infrastructure monitoring teams might have first noticed it when they saw a spike in activity, and maybe they thought it was a DOS attack. Then they realized it was actually an attack on their login endpoint. That's how they know it was a credential stuffing attack. They hand that off to another team to go and investigate. Can they find out, what were the IPs, the ISPs, the user agents, where this attack was coming from, which users were impacted. From there, they have to hand it off to support teams to reach out to those users to recover their accounts. But support might want to work with legal and marketing to put the right phrasing, the right plans together. So it can get really chaotic inside of an organization. So you want to put this type of matrix, this plan in place in advance. This is where we work closely with a lot of our customers to put these plans in place and automate all of that from start to finish. So there is no chaos. It's just automated all the way through. So for example, in-app, what do you do in the case of a high confidence attack? Well, at the login endpoint, what you can do is you can just deny that. If you're 100% confident that this is an attacking entity, you can deny that login flat out. Don't let it into the app. What about in the medium range? What do you do here if there's a login, maybe from an unusual location, but you're not 100% certain if it's an attack or not? This is where you can do an MFA challenge. You can do step-up authentication. If you have the ability to offer 2FA to your users, this is where you would kick that type of flow in. And then if something's in the low end, you can just allow that right in. This is where you can really offer great user experience and low friction, where somebody's coming in from their normal device, nothing looks like an attack. You don't need to introduce friction. This is where you can get that support from your business teams and your product teams to roll out these techniques, because what product and business is always going to ask is, what's the false positive rate? What's the chance that we're going to hurt our conversion rate at this point or that point? And if you can give them an extremely high confidence answer at the high risk range, and you can tell them that that step-up authentication is only going to happen in that medium risk range, and the majority of your users aren't going to see any impact at all, that's where you can start to get buy-in to get these security initiatives onto the roadmap. One other thing to keep in mind, don't just plan for the in-app experience. Think about the out-of-band experience also. Are you going to have to do outreach to the user? When we're talking about user security, you need to always design things from the users, from the end user, from the account owner's perspective. So for example, in that high risk range, you can deny that login outright. But if you're denying that login, we know at this point already that the attacker has that user's credentials. So it would be wise to also follow up with the account owner, send them an email, let them know that you stopped this access to their account, and push them into a password reset flow. Or in that medium risk range, we have an example. One of our, a new employee here, this is a true story, it was just a few weeks ago, he was telling us how from one of his old employers, he had a 401k plan. And on a Sunday night, he got a text message from that 401k plan provider with a PIN code to log into his account. It was a 2FA PIN code. He hadn't tried logging in, yet he got this text message saying, here's your PIN code to log into the app. So he knew right away that somebody was trying to get into his account. But with that text message, he wasn't provided any way to let that app know, wait, this wasn't me. Lock that device. Don't let that device into my account. He had no way of providing feedback. He had to call into customer service, try to get information on what was happening, let them know that wasn't him, and it was this big hassle. So in that medium range, you want to be able to react to the active device, and that's where you can halt it with an MFA challenge, but also make sure you're reaching out to the account owner directly. Provide them the ability to review that activity for themselves and let them give that feedback. Was this you? Yes or no? So you want to design this type of matrix for all of those critical events inside of your application, from registration to login to profile update to transaction. You want to have this planned out in advance. And this also can change, whether we're talking about an ATO scenario here or if we're talking about spam registration. The matrix can look different. There's a lot of different variables that go into this. These are things that we work with every single day with our customers. This is what we really strive to perfect. So if anybody wants to go deeper into these topics, we'd love to chat about it more. This is really, I think, where we excel as a company, as a technology. But I know this isn't meant to be a product pitch, so we'll hold that for after. Let me jump forward into some low-hanging fruit. What are some quick wins that you can introduce to your own apps? If you don't have time to put these long initiatives and plan out all these matrices into your roadmap, what are some quick wins? If you only have 1 or 2 weeks to introduce incremental pieces to strengthen your application security, to strengthen your user security, what could you do? Well, first, don't be a tool for hackers. As we were talking about with the Strava example with their heat maps, be cautious of what you're rolling out and think, what's an unassuming connection here? How might an attacker be able to take advantage of this to maybe figure out which usernames, which email addresses exist on our platform so they can run more effective attacks? Take a look at your registration forms. Take a look at your password reset forms. If you type in a successful username into either of those forms versus an invalid username, what is the response that comes back? Is there something in the UI that gives a tip one way or the other? Is there something in the response codes, in the network response logs, that's tipping off that the username was found or the username was not found? Try to remove those tells from those forms and make it a little bit more mysterious for the attackers. So for example, you could just give a standard response when somebody's using one of those password reset forms and they type in an email address. You can say something like, if we find this email address in our system, we will email you a reset link. And that way it's not giving a tell one way or another if you found that email in your system. The other tip would be, take advantage of open source libraries in order to minimize friction. For example, when somebody is registering for your application, if you don't want to have to send them email confirmation links 100% of the time, then use some of these open source libraries to check, are they using leaked credentials? Are they trying to sign up with disposable emails? Are they coming in from IPs that have bad reputations? If so, you can introduce that extra layer of friction, but just for those scenarios. And the other scenarios, you can keep a low friction flow. So really take advantage of these open source libraries. They're well maintained, they're available for free, and they're extremely beneficial. And lastly, look for cheat sheets out there that have other great tips. OWASP has an amazing cheat sheet for credential stuffing. They give 10 to 12 amazing tips on incremental things you could add to your application to cut down on the impact of credential stuffing attacks in ATO. They're very, very helpful, all of those tips. And so that was all I had for today. I hope you were able to get a few good tips out of that, and you are able to make a little bit more sense of what are these attacks we're seeing today, what are the different vendors, and what are the differences between them, and what should you be considering and looking for as you're either building these tools out internally or you're evaluating vendors to assist you with this.
So, Brian, wanted to also talk a little bit about some of those best practices for remediation after an account has been taken over. Are there some high-level remediation efforts that our attendees can maybe incorporate into their processes, their incident response if there is an account takeover incident?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say the first thing is have a plan in place of the type of copy that you're going to send out to the user. Because if you're able to detect a scenario where there was an ATO on an account, you want to get the message out to the user as quickly as possible. There's some new laws coming out where there was the new California acts that came out where if you do detect a breach on a user's account or on their data, you should try to notify them within 72 hours. We recommend doing it instantly as soon as you find this out. So have that copy ready to go and send them, in that copy, send them information about what you detected. Try to provide some context clues. Don't just say, hey, we noticed an attack, reset your password. Give them some information about what you saw. So give them maybe the IP address, the type of device, the location, the event that occurred, and the time of day. Because if I just receive an email, I might think it's spam, I might ignore it. But if I see, hey, somebody tried logging into your account from this Windows device from Nevada, that's really going to pique my interest as a user because I'm going to see that Nevada and I'm going to know that wasn't me. And then I'm going to be more likely to take action. I'm going to be a little bit swifter on clicking that password reset link. So in that copy, really try to make sure you're able to provide context clues for the user so they can see it and they can be a little bit more alarmed and they're going to take action in that scenario.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. We've got one question from the audience. What are the common attack tools you see in the cyber criminal community?
So the attack tools vary a lot. I mean, it can be anything from just a curl command that they're running through any sort of bash script. I'd say about 5 years ago we saw where Phantom.js and Selenium were really coming on the market. That made it super easy to be able to build some of these headless browsers. Nowadays, I mean, Google provides tools to script headless Chrome browsers. So those are being utilized. There are other tools. I believe one, I don't want to get the name incorrect, but I believe Illuminati is one of them. And this is one where it's extremely easy to write custom bots. You can rotate through user agents very easily. You can rotate through IP addresses. You can say which locations you want the attack run from or you don't want the attack run from. And you can even choose if you want it run from residential IPs like Comcast or non-residential IPs. So these are things that attackers used to have to do manually. It would take a lot of work, so you wouldn't see it very often unless it was a very sophisticated, dedicated attack. Now there's a UI for this. It's as easy to do that as it is for me to submit a JIRA ticket. So there are these UIs that are coming out, these interfaces that make it easy for anyone, even non-engineers, to launch these botnet attacks.
Great, thank you. One more question. what are some of the common methods of monetizing and exploiting compromised accounts?
So that's an interesting one. It really depends on the business. It depends on the application that you're getting into. So let's take retail, for example. One scenario could be if I was able to get into an account, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and change the shipping address. I'm going to change it. I'm going to point it to an anonymous PO box that I own. And that way, whenever the user makes a purchase, the next purchase is going to go to my account. It's going to go to my PO box, and I can get those goods for free. To take it a step further, if I do have a list of stolen credit cards, I'm just going to try making the purchase directly. So that's like a basic type of attack we see on a lot of retail applications. We work with a lot of marketplace applications. So applications where there's a buyer and a seller. So for example, like with Craigslist, where you can go and you can put up items for sale, but you can also explore and purchase items. Here, what we're seeing is a lot of money laundering cases where somebody will do ATOs to get into a lot of buyer accounts. They will then either set up or take over one seller account, and then they'll start putting up fake items for sale. And through their buyer account, they'll use stolen credit cards to buy a lot of things from the seller account that they own directly, and they're essentially just funneling money right through the system from these either spam registration or ATO compromised buyer accounts right into this either fake or ATO compromised seller account. If it is an ATO on the seller account, what they'll have to do is, as soon as they go in, they'll try to change the bank account. And a lot of these sites, they don't do 2FA checks. They don't do any critical checks when somebody's changing something, even as sensitive as banking information, unless it's a high power or high profile account. So unless it's an account that's making, tens of thousands of dollars on the platform, they keep that friction really low, and somebody can quickly do an ATO. They can change the banking routing number and then just flow money right through their own system. So it really depends on the type of application. And just to expand on that a little bit, a lot of times what we're seeing is where the team or the attackers that are running the credential stuffing attack isn't actually the same team, the same entity that's going to do that value extraction. There will be one team that's just running the credential stuffing to figure out which accounts can we get into. And you can think of this as, a sales team or a business development team where they have a huge list of email addresses that they want to send out to, but they're trying to qualify those emails first. They're trying to figure out, which one of these emails are even worth sending messages to. So the credential stuffing attack can be run by one organization that's really just weeding down the list to find qualified accounts. They're not going to do anything with that list other than sell it. They're going to sell it to another group who knows how to extract value from that specific application. So that group is willing to pay $5, $10, $20 per account because they already have a game plan in place where they've come up with a plan of, if we can get into an account, we know how to extract value. And that is going to differ across every application.
Great. Thank you for that answer. All right. So that is pretty much all the questions that we have at this time. If there are questions that you weren't able to ask, either because of the unmute function or because that we went over, feel free to email those questions to me and I will get you in touch with Brian. Again, my email is amy.tate@rhisac.org. Everybody, thank you so much for attending. Brian, any last words before we close?
No, thank you so much, RHISAC, for hosting this. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for everyone that attended. And if anybody wants to dive deeper into these topics, you can reach me, brian@castle.io.
Great, Brian. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. I felt like this was a very interesting, informative session about ATO.